Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property.
Hi, Lorraine.
Hello, Stu. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
Hello, Mike. How you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Nice to see you, Stuart. Nice to see you, Lorraine.
And you, Mike. We're delighted to welcome you back, Mike, to Conveyancing Matters. Lovely Mike Day from Integra Property Services. So thanks ever so much for joining us again. I think you've actually got the dubious honour of being our first returnee, which is quite exciting.
It is. I'm not only to be called lovely, but to be asked back. I'm honoured. Thank you very much indeed.
To be fair, you have got the best office in the history of backdrops and offices. So, you do just put everyone else to shame. So.
Didn't you say that to Rob, Lorraine, though?
Rob Halston, didn't you say that?
I did actually. You've got a habit of saying this to all the guests now.
Yeah. To be fair, actually, because Rob's in a signal box with trains going by, Mike.
I was going to say, I don't have too many trains flying past the window.
How funny. Oh, Stu, I hate you. But actually, one of the reasons that I thought it would be great to have you back, Mike, is because it's probably passed a lot of conveyancers by at the moment, but we've had the Legal Sector Affinity Group new guidance on the money laundering directive and the 2017 money laundering regulations, this sort of umbrella group that's giving the guidance for loads of organizations, bodies and professionals that are sort of caught by the AML regime. And of course conveyancers in particular, of course, we're sort of massively at risk of money laundering, that risk that dirty money is thrown through client account to clean it up. We've all got lots of procedures in place, but I sometimes think that maybe we only pay lip service to it, or to be fair, Mike, that maybe people at the conveyancing coalface that we talk to a lot, aren't necessarily thinking about why they're doing these things. But of course, you, as well as being at the sort of forefront of the agency business, Mike, you run AML training courses. So I just thought, Stu and I thought you would just be a great person to have on to just chat through the new guidance and what we think it means, both for agents and conveyancers. Because I have to say, and this is a really embarrassing admission, and I always make them, but I wasn't particularly aware, I've got to say, Mike, that the extent to which the AML regime really encompassed agents and what they needed to do. So maybe over to you on that.
Thank you. AML, of course, covers the whole thing. So, in a transaction, you've actually got estate agents, legal representatives, conveyancers, probably lenders, brokers, so all of whom have a role to play in AML compliance. From an estate agent's point of view, the key thing is really that the estate agent is often the first port of call, of course, in a transaction. So somebody's putting their property into the marketplace. An estate agent is obliged to undertake AML customer due diligence at that point of time. So there's no transaction yet, the property's coming to the market. At that stage, the vendor, the seller, or sellers, or whatever entity is involved, they have to do their CDD, customer due diligence, on that at the time, and their risk assessment. So ID, risk assessment, etc. An agent has to do the same with a purchaser at the point that an informal offer is accepted, i.e. before they issue, for example, the memorandum of sale to conveyancers, they would have completed or should have completed those same sort of checks on the purchaser. So they're the first port of call, which is why I think, the powers that be want the agents involved, because they're a pair of eyes on things, or should be a pair of eyes on things, before it even gets going. And then, of course, there's an ongoing obligation to handle it all the way through.
I think that's one of the problems, isn't it? That we, before we pressed record, we were kind of touching on this. It's the fact that for the average client, customer, whatever we want to call them, they could be asked to produce this information sort of maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 times throughout the life of a transaction, probably pretty early up front. And I know, Stu, you've talked about this before.
Yeah, definitely. It must be annoying for the client, but it's just such an important subject, isn't it? And obviously, if it goes wrong, there's so many people that are held accountable. And from our point of view, of course, it's very difficult to decide who we can rely on potentially giving us information that we then carry out our checks on. And of course, when the buck stops with us, for example, then can we rely on that person and the information they're giving us? But you can understand why it's frustrating for clients that they amalgamate all this information at the start, pack it all away. Then first thing we do is ask exactly the same thing again. So it is one of those areas where the process is disjointed, but I can't see how we can change that, unfortunately.
No, I think, from my perspective, I mean, all the time I hear from clients, but don't the lawyers do this? Don't the lenders, and I say, yes, they do, or they should be, but you've got to do it as well. And the reality is, I think that the position at the moment, the ability to share that data amongst different parties, there's obviously consent arrangements around GDPR and all sorts of issues, but we'll park those for the moment. But the real key is you've then got one source of data, which until we've got a standard that is absolutely uniform and accepted by everybody, I don't see that happening. I'm sure that if I was overall in government or wherever policing this, I would rather have 3 sets of people looking at it than one person looking at it, because I'm more likely to pick things up through that process than I am through one source. So I think we are going to live with where we are for the moment.
Yeah, and I think, because, you mentioned before we came on air, the Land Reg has mentioned its safe harbour scheme, which is a step towards, setting some sort of ID standard in particular. I mean, the Land Reg have said, well, if, their consultation ended in December, but if a conveyancing firm essentially subscribe to the standard and meet the standard, then if a claim involving negligence and a land registration matter comes forward and the conveyancer shows they met the standard, then the registry won't pursue them. But actually that's a really, really, really narrow definition. And of course, and funny enough, I was going to mention DreamVar, because I find it hard to go through life without mentioning DreamVar most days, Mike, as a conveyancing lawyer. But of course, one of the things about DreamVar, apart from that, they were the cases that actually involved the agents as well, quite interestingly. But of course, the whole of the point of DreamVar was poor ID, stroke AML, reliance, all the rest of it, fraud, but. And quite rightly, the Court of Appeal did not find Michon de Raya negligent. So actually, this idea that the Land Reg won't pursue firms, for negligence only, it really doesn't make it particularly, it's not going to have much teeth, I don't think. And the government are trying to look at, the big digital ID picture, but it's the issue that Stu and I always come back to. It's one of liability. The point Stu just made, where does the buck stop? If there's fraud, if there's hacking, who's going to pick up the tab? And it'll probably be us.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of fundamental points here, that build on that. One is, of course, the major difference between, say, conveyancers and estate agents, apart from we could go on for hours.
Yeah, let's not even go there.
Is that, of course, the money goes through the conveyancer's bank account, whereas it doesn't generally go through the estate agent's bank account. So there is a different level of risk and liability and whatever obviously associated with that. But the word I used there was risk. And there's an awful lot of talk about ID and digital ID and this sort of stuff. And of course, it's part of the process. It's an essential part of, obviously, AML compliance, et cetera, is knowing, the language comes back to the point we were discussing earlier about language. Lawyers tend to use KYC, know your client. Well, again, we don't tend to use that phraseology in estate agency. Lawyers use boon for beneficial own. Again, not terms that, again, if you asked 100 estate agents, they wouldn't know what the hell you're talking about. And so the language isn't joined. The facts might be the same, but the language isn't joined up. So that's an issue. But it's about risk. It's not just about ID. It's about risk. And one of the areas where estate agents fall short is in risk assessments, in looking at the transaction in front of them and identifying the level of risk, for example. So that is often, in the case of a buyer, of course, around the source of funds, the source of wealth. And that's something that they're not as good as they should be as a generalization. And that's, a key area of risk. It's not just about ID.
And how do you view risks, Stu, and how do you try to manage that and handle it?
Well, that's a weighted question, to say the least. Imagine it's obviously extremely difficult, and what Mike said about having more eyes on it. It's exactly what we do. We have sort of a tiered process where there is, excuse me, an information gathering exercise initially, which will be done by more junior staff, but it's top end for us. It's the case handlers that then do the due diligence. And I think the key is there are two different sides to this. There is the investigation of the client, and then there's the investigation of the money, and they're separate. You can't treat it as one, and I think on too many occasions, whether you want to call it know your client profiling, whatever the case may be, I continually come back to and sort of linking the point to what the estate agents do. And I'd love to know from Mike, to what level they do this, because here we will take, for example, 6 months worth of bank statements. The reason we take 6 months, which people often criticize us regarding and think it's a bit OTT, but for us, it's all about profiling that client. And, I want to have a look at that client. I can see that they, I've seen their ID, they're 18 years of age, they're being paid a monthly wage by Tesco's, then they're buying for 1.1 million. I need to profile that client. Does it all match? Does their bank statements and taking a profile of what they do in their life, does that match the property and the scenario that I'm presenting myself with? It's not just a case of, chucking some ID into an electronic system and it spits it out, giving it a pass. Now, you've got to go more than that. You've got to investigate it. And I always say now that, you're investigating the client, you're investigating the money, and you're investigating the property. And that's where the job has become so enormous compared to what it was like 20 years ago. And when I say to the guys in the office, 20 years ago, I'm not even sure if I took ID. I can remember taking a photocopy of a passport now and then, but I'm not even sure when I first started in 1998 whether we did anything at all. Certainly there was no money laundering.
I've had, Stu, I know I mentioned this, sorry to cut across you, but we had years ago, obviously your nan would have told you about this clearly, but we had clients well-known clients that would just sort of turn up, literally, I swear, with £5 notes in a Tesco bag. And because we couldn't be bothered to count it, because it was all a bit of a faff and we'd probably get it wrong, we'd just pile around to the bank with it, and they'd pay, and the bank wouldn't bat an eyelid either.
Those were the days, eh?
Yeah. It was a good thing, but it's kind of off the back of Stu's point. But so, Mike, to pick up on Stu's point, then what what steps
to what extent do estate agents go into? I'd love to know, are we sort of that far apart, or do estate agents go through the same sort of process?
The requirements are basically the same. So as part of an estate agent should be completing a risk assessment on each party, so the buyers, the sellers. And that would pose a few questions, one of which would be, does the transaction fit the profile, if you like, of that individual or individuals? And in the case of a buyer, funding it, the source of that funds. Traditionally, in estate agency, there's been a phrase, proof of funds. And estate agents still talk to me about proof of funds, i.e., the purchaser shows them a bank statement or an account statement with £1 million in it. Of course, no evidence of where that came from, or it might have been in there for 5 minutes and comes out 5 minutes later, all of that type of stuff. And estate agents are still poor at this. They don't like asking the questions. The junior negotiator doing this deal or whatever is a bit embarrassed to talk to some, Mr. Big, high-flying sort of guy about, where the hell did he get his money from? Now, the point is that it's a risk assessment. So it's not 100%, in my view, black and white. It is an assessment of risk. Therefore, if you have a guy, a purchaser, for example, who is the chairman of Microsoft in the UK, you can look him up. You know that he is the chairman of Microsoft. You can look at the book, and he earns £8 million a year. And he tells you that he's saved up £1 million from his salary over the last few years in order to buy this property. That might get a tick from me. as being an acceptable thing. If, however, it was the guy in the high-vis jacket pushing Trigger's broom along the pavement outside your office, and he tells you that he's saved £1 million up out of his salary in the last couple of years, I would question that. Okay, he might have got the £1 million and he might have got it from legitimate means. He might have won the lottery, he might have inherited it, but you should be digging deeper to get to the bottom of that. And as we move forward, obviously, with digital, things like open banking, and that would help with some of the things you just talked about. Instead of taking bank statements, you'd be able to do open banking sort of checks, which would look at the sort of, and this happens more in lettings, funnily enough, because it's about paying the rent every month. And therefore seeing the fact that somebody has that income coming in every month is actually a key factor. With house selling and buying, of course, it tends to be a damn great lump of money. And therefore, the fact that somebody's got a salary or something coming in doesn't usually justify where they've got the money from. It may be equity from somewhere or whatever else. Agents do not generally probe far enough on that subject area. That is a risk area for agents.
It's interesting because in my sort of mind, I always sort of thought that, here in the office, we have our junior staff that will collate the information. And I always imagined that it would be the estate agents collating information. But then, of course, it goes to a more senior level where that information is investigated, checks are done electronically, as well as visually, and so on and so forth. Does the estate agent go the next step? Do they get the copy, for example, of a passport? Do they do an electronic check to verify it? Does it go to the next level?
My view of what an estate agent should be doing is that I still believe in getting physical documentation. One of the things that an estate agent has potentially as an advantage over the majority of conveyancers is that with a seller, invariably they've been to the property, they've met the seller, usually. Not always, but usually. So therefore, getting a face-to-face original document that they can copy and whatever and certify that they saw the original document is a lot more straightforward with the seller. Even with a buyer, that's possible because the buyers invariably have viewed the property and therefore there's been a face-to-face meeting, albeit behind a bandit mask these days, but they've had a face-to-face meeting with the buyer. So I'm still a believer in, where possible, taking physical documentation. But they've really almost certainly got to do an online digital check, some sort of electronic check, because of course, part of the risk assessment is identifying PEPs and sanctions, politically exposed people and sanctions. There's a requirement for that. Realistically, the only way you can do that is through one of the online real-time database providers. So they should be doing that. Then they should be doing their risk assessment, because you can't do your risk assessment until you've gathered all this information, because clearly if somebody is a PEP, they are a higher risk category than if they're not a PEP, for example. So they should be gathering all this information and then doing their risk assessment and going on from there. The agents that I deal with, the people who attend my courses, are in the main trying their best to do that and are in most cases fairly robust, I would suggest. But of course, those are the people who come to my courses and that I'm interacting with. And it's the ones who aren't that are probably where the greater risk is, because maybe I've no idea what's happening with them, quite frankly. I only know what's happening with the ones that obviously I'm interfacing with.
Well, the SRA carried out, clearly the Solicitors Regulation Authority, Mike's kind of obviously really hot on this as far as the solicitors it regulates, and no doubt the CLC is with the licensed conveyancing firms it regulates. But the SRA constantly has got sort of risk review, and it did some research probably about 2 years ago now, actually, but I don't think, it's moved on a bit, but certainly it's interesting about the risk and the threads from what you've both been saying, because actually our sort of profile in the client thing is interesting, because I worked with a guy who he was acting for the sort of young lad who was sort of running around sort of shouting off about buying this house and all the rest of it, and my colleague did sort of think, well, I wonder where he's got his money from, and of course you do think of AML as anti-money laundering as being you know, something very sort of high flying, potentially with a bit of an international element, you know, with, you know, Billy Big Bobs running around. But actually, you know, this lad got his money from, you know, peddling drugs on the corners of the streets in Bedford, you know, so that's the sort of thing we're dealing with. But the SRA did a review, I say it was a couple of years ago now. And it was interesting because I think a lot of conveyancers, Mike, are in many ways, as you know, not as advanced as, you know, you might think they are and we think they should be, because what they found out, and coming back to one of the really central points you made, is that generally conveyancers now were pretty good at source of funds. So where is the money? But what a lot of property lawyers were still falling down on is the source of wealth. Where did you get the money from? And certainly, clearly not so much, you know, over the last 12 months, but, you know, when I've been in, you know, a class with, you know, hundreds of property lawyers over the years, it's always the source of wealth. And some didn't even know what it was, didn't even understand what it was. But also, coming back to one of the points Stu's made, what always, you know, just instinctively bothered me about the source of wealth investigations is that can actually be sort of quite a sort of forensic, looking at the sums, looking at the money, looking at the, you know, looking at the source job. I mean, okay, if somebody inherited 200 grand from their nan, well, that's pretty straightforward even for me. But at the end of the day, I'm not an accountant. And Stu, I'm really genuinely interested to know, do you get the accounts people in your firm involved? How do you deal with that? At the end of the day,
we don't. No, it's all done by the case handlers. And the difficult cases are always where you haven't got documents to sort of back up, or a simple document that gives you an answer. So, for example, you've just said about a probate sale. That's relatively easy to deal with.
Yeah.
If you have somebody buying a property and their wealth came from selling a property last year, the year before, whatever, that's obviously very easy to deal with. We've had not one, not two, we've had 3 clients since we've been open in 2006 that have won more than £1 million in the lottery.
Oh my word!
Okay?
I'm going to deal with you.
Well, that's why everybody should use us, of course. But we've had 3, and yeah, obviously the paperwork they get substantiates everything, so it's really, really, really easy. But the most difficult ones are where, you know, they've saved the money up over long periods of time, or the money's coming from family, friends, giftors. So you've then got to do the similar investigation on them. And then, of course, they've had a gift from somebody. And you can fast have a scenario where the trail becomes enormous. And you're literally going through tons and tons of bank statements, because before you know it, it's not your client you're looking at. It's their mother and father that you're looking at. And, of course, they got the money from savings, but they're now retired. Okay, so you've got to go back 6 months worth of bank statements. Doesn't tell you a hell of a lot. So they're the real difficult scenarios, and that's where the client profiling comes in. You know, as you've said, Lorraine, you can't just rely on a bank statement showing £50,000 sitting in there. It's like, well, where did it come from? And that's what's really difficult, where you don't have the obvious scenario to prove that source of funds. That's what we find really difficult. And Mike, I don't know whether, you know, wouldn't an estate agent sort of go on to look at the giftor and take it to that extent?
Now, you know, so, you know, gifted deposits and things from, you know, parents, grandparents, simple answer is they should, because they should know where the source of funds is coming from. So they should know that it's coming from, you know, Auntie Agnes or whatever it is. I think the reality is they would not be as probing as you're suggesting the conveyancers are, for example. And they probably perceive the risk to them as estate agents as being less, as I say, partly because the money doesn't actually transfer through their bank account, partly because they know you're going to do it, and all of that, and partly because they don't want to do this because they want to get their sale in the book and get on with the job. But in terms of what their obligation is, yeah, they've got the same obligations.
It's interesting, because I would always perceive, and I'm not going to sound like a horrible comment, but maybe estate agents would think to themselves, well, I won't worry too much about going to that extent because the lawyers will.
Well, I'm sure some, you know, I can't, I can't say whether they do or they don't, but it wouldn't surprise me. You know, I'm not, I didn't come over on the last banana boat, you know, and the reality is a lot of estate agents, it's changing, but a lot of estate agents still see this as a tick box exercise.
I can understand their logical and rationale thinking though, because you know we do all this due diligence, and it is a bit like it's another job for somebody else to do, and we always we're veering away from the remit of what we do. You know, my profession was to sell houses, or my profession was to look over legal work, and now of course we're presented with this scenario that we've all got to abide by. So it's difficult.
And I get that all the time, Stuart. I get that all the time. You know, why do we have to do this? Doesn't so and so do it? You know, blah blah. And of course, the answer is yes. But whether we like it or not, as estate agents, they've got to realise that they are the eyes and ears of the state. Okay, and therefore they are, you know, in the front line on money laundering, you know, policing, because they're there to observe it. They're right at the beginning in most situations, and therefore can head the thing off at the pass, in theory, if they do a thorough job.
We were involved, little tip for some other lawyers out there, we were involved with a potentially fraudulent client that tried to transact, and the fraud, although it was discovered, the onset of it was a fraudulent estate agent or an estate agent that didn't exist. So the fraudster actually produced sales particulars from, you know, purporting to be an estate agent that never was. And we now, and most lawyers will have a lawyer checker where they investigate the lawyers on the other side. We have our own internal procedure where we actually, I don't want to use the word investigate the estate agents. It's nothing as big as that. But we will actually go on Rightmove if we're dealing with an estate agent that we've not heard of before, to check that, yep, they are actually selling other properties. You know, it doesn't look like there's anything amiss here, because we want to know, and in terms of part of our profiling, exactly what you've said, Mike. You know, the estate agent has met the client. I might not be meeting the client, and I might, for example, carry out a FaceTime or a video call like this, so I can see them face to face. But I also want to have a quick chat, and we try and utilise the estate agent, not necessarily for, you know, collecting documents or giving us anything, but actually in terms of profiling, you know, it's very handy to say, especially where you might have a sale where you might have Mr. and Mrs. splitting up, that kind of thing. Sometimes I want to, did you actually see the husband and the wife at the property? Just out of interest, you know, but you can actually really hone in on the estate agent's initial contact with that.
She was buried under the floorboards.
That's the one. Yeah, exactly.
I think what's interesting about your dialogue actually is, and I think this, you know, this is one of those things that makes me sort of show my age amongst all the obvious things. Actually, we do often find ourselves, when we're talking about lawyers and agents, we do, and I know it's all digital, it's all online, and it's all marvelous, but we do find ourselves arcing back to the importance of these personal relationships. And certainly when I was in practice, you know, full time, you know, the people I did by far the most amount of work with, the most profitable work, the most productive work, were the really good local agents who actually I knew weren't going to ring me every day, and let's not go there, but who I could, and it's exactly the point you've just made, Stu, who I could ring up, and I had the situation over, you know, a number of years, maybe somebody, you know, one of the sellers I remember was in Australia, but they were selling a house local to us, but I knew that, you know, the local decent, very good agents had met them, and and it was fine, and they were coming back to the UK, so I was quite happy to start the file off and all of that stuff. It all comes back to the quality of these relationships. If you can, as the lawyer, ring up your agent and say, just as you've said there, Stu, well, what about this? Have you met them? Have you done that? It does come back, I think, to the ability to do that.
I don't think lawyers use estate agents enough in these kind of circumstances. Also things like chasing chains and so on and so forth. And I've never, ever, ever asked an estate agent to do something for me that will aid the movement of the transaction for them to then say that no, or they wouldn't do it. If 100% of the time, they'll go, yeah, of course, yeah, I saw them. They'll give you whatever you want to know, because, you know, it's solely in their interest to move the transaction forward. So absolutely. I've never, you know, I don't know why we don't use agents more often to help us.
I agree entirely. I mean, and the vast majority of estate agents, not all now, because there's lots of different models out there, but the vast majority, of course, are on no sale, no fee. So it's absolutely in their interest to get this transaction through. But the vast majority of estate agents want that transaction to be right. They're not looking to sort of do a whole load of dishonest sort of stuff. The thing about relying on somebody else or working with somebody else is important. But clearly, the reliance on people, the last set of regulations, the 2017 money laundering regs with the 2019 amendment, gives you some ability to rely on a third party to supply certified copies of documents or something, and that sometimes has to be the way it is. But it's incumbent upon, say, the agent, if he's relying on a lawyer to send him a copy of some documents or whatever it may be, he's got to make sure that that lawyer is fine, okay? So, or another estate agent. Now, if that other estate agent was, I don't know, Knight Frank or somebody, and I've got something from them saying, look, we've undertaken our due diligence and we were happy with it, in the event of it being investigated, we'll make it available to you. I probably would rely on that in many cases. If it was Fudd Puckett and Co. operating from a back bedroom in Peckham that I'd never heard of, maybe not. So, there's that judgment call. The risk assessment, ultimately, it's a judgment call. And you've got to imagine, or the negotiator or whoever, that they're in court with their hand on the Bible or the Quran or the Beano or whatever it is they're going to swear by. And they've got to be able to turn around and say, we thought this was okay. And therefore, they need to go as far as they need to get to the situation where they can honestly say, we thought this was all right. Will they be 100% right in every case? Probably not.
No, I think that's the key, isn't it? I think we got to sort of say that, a lot of people have this sort of strange attitude that, we're never going to act and we're never going to have contact with, these type of fraudsters, but of course you will. And, as long as you've done what, you get asked that question, did you do all you could? Did you have any reasonable doubt? No, I didn't. Then that's enough almost.
And providing you can demonstrate the process you went through.
Exactly right, of course.
So it's the audit trail almost that you're creating through having a risk assessment, etc. So you can at least demonstrate to whoever might be investigating to say, well, look, here's what we did. Now, somebody might well then pick the bones out of that a little bit or whatever. But basically, if you haven't got that in place, and this is what I say to agents, if you haven't got a risk assessment in place, how are you ever going to show somebody that you even thought of this stuff?
I say that all the time, Mike, to conveyancers. It's not exclusive to, to agents or any other party in this conveyancing chain, really. I find myself saying that all the time in training sessions. Sort of on the way the analogy I use, I said, treat it like showing your maths working out in a maths exam.
Yeah.
You've got to show your reasoning. And actually, it's interesting you say about, the risk assessment and what you thought was okay, because I'm actually aware of a solicitor, now clearly a lot of them, but who basically left a firm because the partnership thought that person had been not, I think, involved in money laundering, but thought that they hadn't done enough to guard against the possibility of a foreign-based client money laundering. And the really interesting thing was that this solicitor had enough knowledge of the client. To be fair, the solicitor was actually quite slapdash in many ways. They themselves weren't bent and fraudulent, and frankly I'm not sure anybody ever thought they were. But the really interesting thing was that actually that person went to the solicitors disciplinary tribunal. It is reported, and the SDT believed them, in the sense that they were able to demonstrate that they had enough of a relationship with the client that they didn't think the client was money laundering, and that was they weren't struck off, quite frankly, and frankly the paperwork and the audit trail in that particular case wouldn't have been particularly good, but it can work and it must work, really. But
certainly Lorraine, in terms of as you know, estate agents are if you like supervised by HMRC. Well, if there was ever a body that has a vested interest in making sure people aren't fiddling tax and the bang, it's HMRC. Okay, so okay, in the conveyances you've got the CLC, you've got the SRA, the solicitors, whatever. But we've got HMRC. Okay, so doesn't get they're the big daddy of this, and they do spot checks. You know, they will come into agents. I've got around about probably pushing 900 estate agency clients, you know, and I reckon 15 to 20% of them have had a visit. So it's not a question of if you're going to get a visit, it's a question of when.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And now those are visits, they're not just rocking up and barging in through the door with truncheons and demanding things. It's usually an appointment, unless they had a reason that they were suspicious about something. They actually book an appointment to come in, and they sit down with the agent, basically go through, make sure they've got the appropriate documentation, that they're training their people, that they've got the policies and procedures and all that type of stuff in place. And then they will obviously look at a few files. And that's, you know, and then they'll dig under the surface of those files. Now, that's happening now. That's happening all the time. Now, you know, I think it's fair to say if you're an agent in Mayfair dealing with a lot of international clients and multi-million-pound deals, you're probably, you know, your risk profile and whatever is obviously completely different to a firm in the wilds of Yorkshire or something dealing with, you know, local people, you know, et cetera, and lower value property. But nevertheless, the same things apply. And agents, certainly the ones who see me, they are concerned about getting caught and clobbered. So that does have some teeth. But the big area that agents fall down on, apart from the risk assessment, is they then don't report suspicious activity. And as you know, and everybody watching will know, you know, if you're suspicious, you should raise a suspicious activity report through your money laundering reporting officer to the NCA. The last set of figures I saw showed something like, you know, 1 million SARs, 1 million suspicious activity reports made, less than 1% of them had been made by estate agents. Now, you know, so you could have a transaction where the lawyer reported it, a lender reported it, and the estate agent didn't. Well, I wonder who's going to get a knock on the door.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, because there was actually, you know, sort of suggestions, I don't, again, probably in the last couple of years, Mike, that lawyers were sort of being overcautious, and via the MLROs were making, you know, way more reports than were actually needed. I mean, the one slight, you know, jump off I would take here for the benefit of, you know, to be frank, perhaps more junior conveyancers watching this, you know, the 2 or 3 points I would make from that is, if, firstly, you know, trust your instinct, trust your gut. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. But secondly, if you are a more junior member of a team, you know, the 2 or 3 absolute sort of watchwords really are, you know, don't talk to the client, don't express a suspicion to the client because you might be tipping them off. Go straight to your boss, your principal, your team leader, your money laundering reporting officer. But for goodness sake, you know, don't take any steps yourself. Make sure you're properly supported.
Yeah, and I agree with that. What should happen is they should report it to their MLRO. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that needs to be in black and white, because you're setting up an audit trail. So they should report it to their MLRO, and that's an important role, because that person will then decide whether or not they take it to the NCA or not. Now, if they don't, they should document why they haven't. If they do, then obviously there's a process in making the suspicious activity report. But there's no downside to making a suspicious activity report, okay? And it, providing when you make that report, you ask for a consent, you ask for a defence against money laundering, it means that once you've done that, you can't get dragged into a money laundering offence. So why wouldn't you make that report if you were suspicious? Now, you don't want to waste the people's time by sending every case to the NCA, for example. But I tell you, there are probably far more cases that should be reported than currently are.
It's simple, isn't it? You're covering your own back.
Well, there is an element of doing the right thing, and there's an element of backside covering. Absolutely.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Another interesting point, just go back on a few bits we discussed earlier with the agents. And if you forget GDPR and whatnot, we find that a lot of local agents on the high street, for example, will know local people. So they will actually know that, you know, Joe Bloggs works with X, or Joe Bloggs had this particular house 10 years ago and we sold it then. So I think that with local estate agents, they do tend to keep local relationships with local people fairly strong. I think they're good at that. So the knowledge they have in terms of profiling sometimes can be really, really useful.
Agree. And that's about, you know, like, we've had this conversation in the past, but that's about how do we work together, you know, in the process. I think we're still going to have some duplication in things being done. We, you know, estate agents do it, conveyancers do it, whatever. But there's no reason why certain elements of that can't be more collaborative than they currently are. You know, within the confines of data protection and whatever.
Yeah, of course.
So with that in mind, Mike, and perhaps because we could go on all morning chatting to you, we said this last time, would you say that your AML training is, you know, suitable for conveyancers, for example? I mean, I can see a lot of people sitting here watching you, perhaps coming across you for the first time, think, yeah, I could talk to this guy. I could sit and listen to him. He's talking my language. So do you get conveyancers on your training courses, Mike? And how do people find you?
Yeah, the short answer is I do get some conveyancers on my training courses. It is predominantly estate agents, but of course, you know, the variances are things like who supervises who and whatever. But the principles and the basic processes are exactly the same. So I would say, wouldn't I, that it would be relevant for a conveyancer to come to my training courses. If nothing else, it would inform them about what the estate agent has to do. And therefore it would help from that point of view. But actually what we cover is relevant to conveyancers. It's just that I might well be mentioning, for example, HMRC, whereas it's the SRA or CLs. But those are the only real variances in the process. I mean, I run a lot of training courses. I have to say that money laundering, my anti-money laundering course is probably my most popular and well-attended courses. I run them every month. The next one's 24th of February. I'm not sure when this is going out, but it's fully booked. So I've actually put another one in for the 25th of February. So, and people can access all of my training courses, me and everything, on my website, which is Integra, INTEGRA-PS.com. Or quite frankly, if you can't find me on any of the social media channels or whatever else, then I'm not doing my job properly. So if somebody wants to find me, I'm sure they can.
Yeah, or they can contact us. Well, Mike, it's just been a joy to talk to you again. And, you know, thanks very much for sharing your insights, you know, just hugely helpful, hugely interesting. And you might soon be hold the auspicious title of being the person we invite back for a third time, Mike. So,
well, what can I say? It's been an absolute pleasure as always, Stuart, Lorraine. I hope the watchers, listeners have found it of interest and some benefit, and I very much look forward to another opportunity of catching up. Thank you.
Bless you. Thanks. Bye.
Take care, guys. See ya. Bye.
Bye.